Warning. In this video, I raise issues and cover information regarding our future that some viewers could find distressing. However, I believe in the importance of providing this information in an accessible and engaging format to raise awareness and to allow it to be used to inform future decision making. With this in mind, proceed at your own discretion. What do I actually mean by the collapse of civilization? Well, upon hearing the phrase, many people may feel inclined to envision a zombie apocalypse, a nuclear war, a Terminator-esque robot takeover, or an oversized meteor from outer space, precipitating our instant collective demise. I suppose these occurrences aren't necessarily beyond the realms of plausibility, although the reality of our predicament is likely to be far less grandiose in nature. Collapse could be seen as being synonymous with simplification. The civilization in which we currently live is the most complex in history, and it is sustained by myriad interlinked factors, forming a system that is, in some ways, analogous to an engine. All aspects of it must be working in harmony in order to produce a fully functioning system. In this way, complexity could be seen as a weakness, as though we're observing a Jenga tower be gradually built up and up and up, until it all eventually comes toppling down. So, what collapse truly is a return to simpler times, a more sustainable way of living, the reduction in the scope of a civilization, and, importantly, a reduction in population. It appears as though our own collapse scenario may be closer than we think. Now, this all sounds quite terrifying, and I wish I could foresee a more wholesome future for humanity. As I will raise here, there are many threats that we are currently facing, or that will make themselves known in the near future, that could have severe implications. So, let's discuss why civilization may collapse in the coming decades, and how we can prepare ourselves for the future. We've all become quite accustomed to capitalism. So much so, in fact, that it is quite difficult to imagine life without it. However, it doesn't take a seer to discern that this system has its fair share of flaws. Perhaps the most notable of these flaws is its requirement for infinite economic growth. Infinite economic growth on a finite planet. This just simply will not work. This chart demonstrates a fairly consistent annual rise in the GDP of the US. Intuitively, we may feel inclined to say that economic growth is a good thing, and in some ways, it is. However, economic growth is always going to be positively correlated with resource consumption. A consumption rate is going to continue to raise year on year. Planet Earth will only be able to support us pushing our economic development so far. This gives way to exponential growth. As demonstrated by the chart, the annual GDP increases as a percentage of the prior value, a value that is becoming higher almost every single year. To conceptualize this, we could take the number 1,000, for example, and increase it by 5%, giving us 1,050. However, the base value is now higher, and increasing it by a further 5% will lead to a larger net increase in the value. Now we have, rounded up, 1,102, 1,157, 1,216, 1,277, 1,340, and so on and so forth. If this process is carried out a couple hundred times and the results are put into a line graph, we're presented with the following. The results here are quite staggering. If we consider the initial value that was used, 1,000, and compare it against the value that we ended up with, 15 million, a significant disparity is apparent. While this does demonstrate the profound effects of exponential growth, the percentage used with which to perform each incremental calculation is somewhat unrealistic. What if we apply the notion of exponential growth to America though? By adding up each percentage change in GDP since 1962 and dividing it by the number of years elapsed, 61, we can calculate the average percentage change in GDP per year. The total percentage change in GDP is 176.5, and the average, rounded up, is 2.9%. If we assume that growth in the US economy will remain relatively consistent with this metric, then we can use the rule of 70 of economic growth to estimate how long it will take for each doubling in GDP to occur. This is calculated by dividing 70 by the average GDP percentage change of the US economy cited earlier, which gives us a value of 24. What this indicates then is that the US economy is likely to double every 24 years. From the year of the publishing of this video, this would be 2048. Imagine the extent of resources already required to prop up the US economy. And then imagine these resources doubled in a mere 24 years. Imagine attempting to sustain another New York, another Las Vegas, another Chicago. Approximately 17% of the world's energy already goes to America to sustain a mere 5% of the population. It is easy now to visualize how such strain on our energy production could pose severe economic issues.
About close to half the stock is owned by about 1% of the population, and the bottom 80% of the population hold about 4% of the stock. And it's always, and the corporations are interlinked, like a bank will own a big piece of one corporation. I mean, it's a massive system of highly concentrated power, given the rights of immortal persons, but without the responsibility of persons. These are amoral institutions. In fact, there are private tyrannies which are amoral and required to be amoral. They move towards, so they want to avoid monopoly because then they get public service requirements, but they want to be very limited. So just a few of them, which can have what are called strategic alliances. They can effectively act together.
Capitalism's insatiable appetite for growth has been permitted by the normalization of neoliberal policies, and, in particular, the minimization of government influence and power in exchange for corporate dominion. Money is the be-all and end-all of much political discourse in Western countries operating under capitalism, meaning that many wealthy corporate elites are capable of influencing policies through a process of lobbying. This can often take the form of glorified bribery, leading many politicians to make decisions that are of benefit to the corporation in question. Fossil fuel giants, for example, have been granted an extraordinary level of power due to the vast wealth they have accumulated. In fact, the Environmental and Energy Study released statistics demonstrating that 80% of the world's energy is still supplied by fossil fuels. The salient issue that this arrangement highlights is the detrimental implications of many of the actions and processes undertaken by these corporations. The catastrophic consequences of a fervent desire to meet the high demand for cheaply available energy, products and services have manifested in myriad ways, such as biodiversity loss, topsoil erosion and global warming, all issues that will be elucidated in due course.
Presidential candidate John McCain included a climate plank in his campaign program. It was insufficient given the gravity of the situation, but it was a start. Republicans in Congress were also exploring such options. The huge Koch brothers energy conglomerate got wind of this, quickly went into action. For years they'd been working hard to ensure that the party never veered from climate denialism, and they weren't going to tolerate this deviation. They launched a huge juggernaut, bribery, intimidation, an enormous lobbying campaign, fake citizens group, and all-out assault. The efforts were successful. You know the consequences. I don't have to run through them.
At present, these actions are justified on the basis of potential financial gain, oftentimes even irrespective of their ethical implications. In this light, perhaps we could perceive politicians to be merely puppets, acting on the whims of hidden, unseen masters, mouthpieces for those who would seek to continue to proliferate their harmful agendas in exchange for profit. We can see then that there are fundamental issues within Western societies that impede positive change from occurring. That which adversely affects our world is just simply too profitable to warrant this positive change. In the US, corporate dominion is apparent in the political sphere, demonstrated through the promulgation of an anti-intellectualism movement that seeks to propagandize the population through climate and general science denialism.
The climate change agenda is a hoax.
Unfortunately, we have people around the world who are proselytizing lies and distortions and non-scientific information. The disinformation is a problem for us.
Movements such as this have been used extensively to prop up ideas and agendas that benefit the corporations concerned by undermining the mechanisms by which revolts and uprisings could be facilitated.
The Supreme Court, now properly reactionary, is about to consider a case which, if approved, will constitute a major step towards preventing the government from enacting measures to restrict the use of fossil fuels or to limit the effects of environmental destruction. If approved, it will also serve as a precedent for others that are winding their way through the legal system, relying on a variety of intricate artifices designed by the high-priced law firms that are making their own crucial contributions to the project of destroying organized life on Earth. The euphoria in the executive offices of the fossil fuel companies is matched only by what you see in the offices of the weapons producers. They no longer have to face the annoyance of fending off environmental activists. They're now praised for pouring poisons into the atmosphere and urged to do more, accelerating the march to destruction.
Perhaps the party most guilty of taking this approach is the Republican Party, with prolific figures such as Donald Trump making his climate denialist stance publicly known, while also undermining the efforts of environmental activists.
But I think we want to work with you to really recognize the changing climate and what it means to our forests, and actually work together with that science. That science is going to be key, because if we ignore that science and sort of put our head in the sand and think it's all about vegetation management, we're not going to succeed together protecting Californians.
Okay, it'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
Well, I don't think science knows, actually.
Ron DeSantis argues that climate change is little more than an attempt to impose an ideological agenda on the American people, enacting bills in Florida to ban endeavors to adopt 100% clean energy goals. In addition to this, anti-intellectualist agenda pervades the curriculums of Florida's schools, portraying global warming as being part of natural long-term cycles instead of acknowledging the anthropogenic component of it. The antagonization of environmental activists has also been encouraged, with them being likened to Nazis to discourage school children from seeing the crisis from their point of view. This mentality permeates the party as a whole, with most Republicans seeing climate change as a natural phenomenon that is not influenced by human action, while also placing little emphasis on addressing the issue.
I come here today with a message. As President, I have a responsibility to act with urgency and resolve when our nation faces clear and present danger. And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger. The health of our citizens and our communities is literally at stake. The UN's leading international climate scientists call the latest climate report nothing less than, quote, code red for humanity. Let me say it again. Code red for humanity. It's not a group of political officials, elected officials. These are the scientists. We see it here in America, in red states and blue states. Extreme weather events costing $145 billion. $145 billion in damages just last year. Climate change is literally an existential threat to our nation and to the world. So my message today is this. Since Congress is not acting as it should, and these guys here are, but we're not getting many Republican votes, this is an emergency, and I will look at it that way. I said last week, and I'll say it again loud and clear. As president, I'll use my executive powers to combat the climate crisis in the absence of congressional action.
To avoid committing to a keyhole view of American politics, we should also consider the intentions of the Republican Party. They appear to be much more open to considering the impact of human action on the climate and how to mitigate it, which has been demonstrated through the policies they have enforced. The Inflation Reduction Act is a major example of this, which entailed putting forward $369 billion towards various climate programs and projects. While this most certainly is a step in the right direction, its efficacy could also be brought into question with the following considerations. Routine increases in GDP will reduce or perhaps even cancel out the impact of developing green energy sources as demand for products continues to rise, thus leading to a higher resource consumption rate. The bill will also still not put the US on track to meet the Paris Climate Summit agreements. It could be argued that not nearly enough is being done to mitigate climate change, despite many perceiving the bill to be revolutionary, as the investment made is not commensurate to the magnitude of the problem being faced. While perhaps a somewhat controversial position, the motive here could be perceived to be similar to that of the Republican Party, although the means by which corporate enrichment is promoted are vastly different. It could be seen as a strategy to delude the population and to provide them with a sense of comfort in their current situation, to encourage the view that politicians are doing all that they can to mitigate the crisis, and that they are in good hands, thus disincentivizing individual and collective action. This perspective may not sound all too appealing, and perhaps may even sound conspiratorial. However, you may see it receive more grounding once I have elaborated on the ecological ailments that I believe to be plaguing humanity. The development of our civilizations throughout history has been considerable since early Homo sapiens, and even our close ancestors, such as the Homo erectus, lived in relatively simplistic communities. So simple and small scale, in fact, that we may not even be able to refer to them as civilizations. Nowadays, our civilization is so advanced that it is nigh indistinguishable from these early civilizations. An interesting point to note, though, is that the vast majority of civilizational development within the time span that Homo sapiens have existed on this planet occurred within a mere 200 years. This is despite the fact that Homo sapiens have been roaming Earth for approximately 200,000 years, meaning that developments in the complexity of our civilizations has been more reminiscent of a spike than a gradual process. The reason for this spike is quite pronounced in much of the infrastructure we see today and that we depend upon for the maintenance of both ourselves and the societies in which we live. Electricity to power our homes, fuel to keep our cars moving, fertilizers to grow our crops efficiently. It is all reliant on an ancient form of energy that we discovered at the beginning of this period of approximately 200 years. Fossil fuels. Their discovery led to the inception of a time in history known as the Industrial Revolution, whereby we were first able to use this energy source to power machines that would greatly increase the efficiency of labour functions, while simultaneously reducing the amount of energy that would need to be expended by the human being. They paved the way for a substantial increase in quality of life that would become more pronounced as these machines became more sophisticated and normalized. For the first time in history, we were able to mitigate much of the negative feedback that kept our civilizations from developing and our population from drastically expanding. This negative feedback included factors such as food and water availability, predators, climate, and disease. Energy abundance permitted us to grow food at an alarmingly high rate and to establish a rapid international trade system. It allowed us to regulate temperatures and to provide us with comfortable homes. It expedited our medical development to the point where we have little concern for many of the ailments that used to take our lives in great numbers. It brought, and still continues to bring, unprecedented changes. We have been thrown into a period characterized by human prosperity, and one that is highly abnormal in comparison to the rest of history. Our contemporary civilization is, by far, the greatest ever known, trivializing all that existed prior. As raised earlier, energy use is correlated with economic growth, and, in many cases, population growth. This is demonstrated quite profoundly in the following human population chart, which shows how considerable an increase in population has occurred during the fossil fuel era. From 1800, the early to mid-stage of the Industrial Revolution, human population has exploded from 1 billion to 8 billion, a staggering 8-fold increase. To find out why this should be interpreted as a significant problem, it is important to consider the role that ecology has to play in this growth of the human enterprise. One important ecological principle is carrying capacity, which is expressed in reference to a region occupied by a species. It dictates the population of the species in question that the region is capable of sustaining, taking into account variables such as the amount of resources available and the prevalence of predators. Generally, when a species exceeds its carrying capacity, this indicates that the amount of resources that are naturally generated in the region is exceeded by the consumption rate of the species. Subsequently, the population of this species must eventually reduce back below the carrying capacity, or the species will need to spread out to other regions, thus leading to a higher aggregate carrying capacity. However, in some situations, there are alternatives. 1. A species is able to avoid negative feedback, such as predators and disease. 2. A species has access to an abundance of resources that cannot be replenished in a timely manner so as to be sustainable. With these criteria fulfilled, a species is able to draw down on this abundance of resources and grow its population unfettered, as there is not sufficient negative feedback to keep said population in check. This process can be referred to as drawdown. During the drawdown process, a species will place itself into what is known as overshoot. This is a circumstance whereby a species carrying capacity for a region or aggregate carrying capacity has been exceeded, meaning that the existence of the additional members of the species that the fulfillment of this criteria permitted is a temporary arrangement, which lasts as long as it holds. Overshoot was clearly demonstrated in an incident that occurred at St. Matthew Island. In 1944, 29 reindeer were introduced to the island, which was, at the time, largely devoid of species that would usually predate on reindeer. The island was also rich with lichen, which is a preferred food for reindeer. This facilitated a substantial growth in reindeer population on the island, as they were afforded resource abundance and were not subjected to negative feedback. Even only 13 years later, in 1957, the reindeer population on the island had skyrocketed from the original number of 29 reindeer to over 1,300. 6 years later, the population had increased even more so, with 6,000 reindeer being noted present on the island. At this point, it was clear that the island was severely overpopulated, and that this level of reindeer population would not be sustainable. The resources on the island just simply would not be able to regenerate fast enough to account for it. As expected, 3 years later the island was almost devoid of reindeer life. Only 42 remained from the original 6,000 that were present prior. Eventually, all the reindeer on the island died, leaving what was once an expansive herd as skeletons littering the island. This all occurred in a mere 23 years. While many people may feel apprehensive to ascribe ecological concepts to human beings, or perhaps even believe that they are inapplicable entirely, it is true that our upkeep is predicated on a large supply of resources. We are one of the most important entities in almost every ecosystem, and our desire to expand has even led us to impinge on ecosystems that should be detached from us. In order to satiate our desire for resources, we have been destroying the natural environments in which we source them from. We have been provided with the inputs to do this, as fossil fuels have allowed us to greatly expedite the process. So, while we may believe that we have transcended nature, we are just as reliant on it as all the other species we share this planet with. Fossil fuels are, after all, products of nature. Ingredients for food and building materials are sourced from products of nature. Water is a product of nature.
We can't avoid the reality that humans are biophysical entities, that we are ecological species that have evolved as components of nature, and that we require, just to breathe, a certain energy flow. Historically, that energy flow has always been solar energy through our food supply. We broke from that just about 200 years ago. And with this extrasomatic or outside the body source of energy called fossil fuel, we've vastly increased our capacity to exploit and destroy the planet. And so we see everywhere measurements of the decline in forest fertility. North America has lost 50 to 70% of the organic nutrients that took 11 or 12,000 years in the post-glacial period to accumulate. So in less than 200 years of deep tillage agriculture, half of that's gone, or 70% is gone. And the only way we maintain the productivity of the Great Plains is through the massive applications of fertilizers and pesticides and increasing irrigation. U.S. agriculture, heavily irrigation dependent, but the Ogallala Reservoir, which supplies so much of that, the groundwater supply, is drying up. California is in deep trouble. They provide, what, a third of all the table vegetables in North America.
One critique of an ecological view of human civilization is that we are continuing to sustain ourselves despite the proposition that we are firmly in overshoot. While this does appear to be true, as our population has been increasing rapidly since the 1800s, it does not consider why this may be occurring. As mentioned earlier, carrying capacity can be aggregate. Many individual regions have already surpassed their carrying capacity, despite humans continuing to live in them. This is because of globalization and international trade. We are, essentially, able to share a global carrying capacity by importing resources that have already been depleted in our own region from other regions. Ecologist William E. Rees and his associates devised the ecological footprint concept, which is the amount of productive land required to sustain a human being and to assimilate their wastes. It is measured in hectares.
We are currently about 75% in overshoot. We're using the planet as if it were 75% larger, and that's an underestimate. And to put it in very simple terms, the per capita biocapacity on Earth is about 1.58 hectares. That's in 2018. So each of us would be entitled to the productivity and assimilative capacities of about 1.58 hectares. A hectare is 2.47 acres. But on the planet right now, the average eco-footprint at inadequate average material standards is 2.77 global average hectares. So we're almost, as I say, 75% over the top. Each of us, and that's average. In North America, we're 8 hectares per capita, which means we're, 3 or 4 times above the fair share of our planet. And many species in nature go through cycles. Okay, it's a boom-bust cycle. Things get good, we expand. Then negative feedback kicks in, we crash. Then we get good and expand. Humans have never done that. Not globally. We've done it locally. But now, for the first time, we've managed to, in effect, colonize the entire planet. We've grown by... Listen, we are growing by liquidating our capital. You cannot continue to grow by liquidating the natural capital basis of your own existence. And so we get to the point where we become so large, there's simply insufficient there to maintain even the maintenance activities, let alone further growth.
At present, fossil fuels account for approximately 80% of the world's energy production. This is already presented as a major issue, and environmental activists push for a transition to a system that is reliant on renewable sources of energy. Not only is the effect of our extensive reliance on this non-renewable energy source being felt through the implications of climate change, but I also have reason to believe that it will be felt in the future through its relationship with our economic system. Many people like to argue that we need not concern ourselves about the current state of our energy system, as the resources required to sustain it are still abundant on planet Earth. At first glance, the statistics do check out. Perhaps we could feasibly sustain ourselves on this system for a considerable time frame, and a renewable energy system could be delayed for a while. Well, it's not that simple. This denotes the amount of energy that must be invested to extract the resource against the amount of energy that it provides in ratio format. The significance of EROI in the upkeep of our economic system manifests in energy scarcity. Generally, the more energy that is required to extract the resource, the less economically viable it is to extract. If we look back to the inception of the Industrial Revolution and the period since then, our energy resources were considerably more abundant than they are now, which entails a high EROI. The deposits from which we source these resources were much more easily accessible, meaning that the amount of energy required to extract them was, generally, quite a bit lower. Nowadays, many of these easily accessible deposits have been depleted, meaning that the EROI of much of our energy resources has reduced quite dramatically. A report from 2014, written by Hall and colleagues, made some stark and worrying observations. The EROI for the production of oil and gas globally by publicly traded companies has declined from 30 to 1 in 1995 to about 18 to 1 in 2006. The EROI for discovering oil and gas in the US has decreased from more than 1,000 to 1 in 1919 to 5 to 1 in the 2010s, and for production from about 25 to 1 in the 1970s to approximately 10 to 1 in 2007. Alternatives to traditional fossil fuels, such as tar sands and oil shale, deliver a lower EROI, having a mean EROI of 4 to 1 and 7 to 1, respectively. What is important to note is that these statistics are also quite dated. This is likely to indicate that EROI has seen an even more substantial decline than that which has been portrayed here. We have, essentially, picked the low-hanging fruit, and now more drastic measures must be taken to extract fossil fuels. Fracking is a prime example of this. It is a process that is more expensive than typical oil drilling, and also deals substantial damage to the environment through the production of wastewater, habitat destruction, and the use of toxic chemicals. Oil is the backbone of our civilization. It has been the primary driver of much of our economic growth ever since it was first discovered. While we have begun to incorporate other fossil fuels into our energy mix, oil still stands as a vitally important resource. It fuels vehicles and planes, while also providing energy to homes, to our technology, and to the industrial sector. As a result, it has always been in very high demand. The mid-1900s saw a boom in oil production, and oil discoveries were at an all-time high. An important figure during this period was geologist and geophysicist M. King Hubbert, who conducted research on the trends in oil extraction. A prevalent pattern he noted during his investigations was that an oil well begins with a low level of production that would gradually rise. Each year, more barrels would be produced than the year prior. However, each oil well would inevitably reach a plateau in production, whereby a decline would eventually follow. At this point, the production pattern would be reversed. Fewer barrels would be produced each year than the year prior. Following this, there would come a time where the well would be completely exhausted. When demonstrated on a line graph, the shape of the line would end up resembling that of a bell curve. Hubbert was able to generalize this understanding to an entire oil field, and the cumulative production of all the oil wells within the field would follow a similar pattern of production. He held that the pattern would be consistent for the entirety of America's oil production and even the planet's cumulative oil production. Appropriately, he named his theory peak oil, then used it to predict when America's oil production would reach this plateau and subsequent decline. The question is then, was Hubbard correct? Well, he predicted that America's oil production would peak between 1965 and 1970. And he actually wasn't too far off the mark. It peaked at 9.6 million barrels per day in 1970, and a decline occurred following this. However, this decline was not necessarily consistent, as there were other factors that skewed oil production. Much of these factors can be attributed to technological advancements that increase the amount of reserves that could be feasibly accessed, with fracking being an example of one such advancement. It seems that such technologies delayed the peak in his theory. While the year he predicted for the peak was not entirely accurate, reaching said peak can still be seen as an inevitability, given how oil is a non-renewable resource. How important is the notion of peak oil to collapse though? As mentioned earlier, oil underpins our civilization, meaning that we depend heavily on it for maintenance actions. What is crucial to note about the peak and subsequent decline depicted in Hubbard's theory is its economic implications. While we have become accustomed to cheaply available oil, a decline in the availability and production of this vital resource will lead to increased energy prices. With increased energy prices, other functions will become more expensive to perform, such as the transportation of food and the maintenance of appliances. This will subsequently lead to higher inflation rates, making it gradually more and more difficult for the average person to make a living. As the decline continues to exacerbate, people will need to become content with living with less, and rates of homelessness will increase as the economy approaches the precipice and social unrest rises. The implications of increasing energy prices have already been felt quite dramatically in the UK, influenced significantly by the Russia-Ukraine war. People unable to afford to heat their homes during the winter, protests occurring on the streets, and essential workers resigning due to feeling dissatisfied with the low wages they receive in proportion to the cost of living.
500 with bills that comes to 800, 700. So that leaves you sometimes around about 200 quid. Maybe for food, doctors, anything like that. We're all writing our CVs at the moment. You stay because of the students. I don't want to abandon my students. They're kids who haven't done anything wrong.
So, what do the statistics say about peak oil? While the consensus of the International Energy Agency holds that peak production of conventional crude oil occurred in 2006, whether the peak of all oil production has been reached is uncertain. Some hold that we have passed the peak, as a lower oil production can be noted since 2018. However, we should also take into account how the pandemic has influenced oil production. A relatively steep decline occurred in response to a lower demand for oil, meaning that these statistics have been skewed somewhat. I would argue that we require more information before drawing a conclusion here. It is also important to note that the peak has been further prolonged through accessing shale oil and tar sands.
Since the 2008 financial crisis, 80 to 90% of global oil growth came from the U.S. shale industry. And so when you understand that GDP is really a one-to-one relationship to energy growth, we can thank the United States shale industry. 10% is lost of our 100 million barrels a day every year. This year, next year, the year after. That, and of the 10 to 11, the United States accounts for about 40% of that because shale declines 45% a year. So we lose 3.5 million barrels a day just from shale oil. And so this is the problem that the world isn't really focused on. And so we're going to remain in a plateau. But my analysis suggests after 2025, these declines are going to really start to kick in.
How long these practices will be able to prolong the peak is up for debate though, with some sources claiming that it has already been reached. Either way, the fact of the matter is that while the world may have not reached peak oil yet, its looming inevitability is a disaster just waiting to happen. There is an important psychological and cultural factor at play here that is so thoroughly embedded within our lives so as to be seemingly inseparable. Consumerism is a mental model and societal norm that emerged alongside capitalism and has remained largely ubiquitous within societies that operate under it. Permitted by our energy surplus, our mindsets have shifted from that of survivalists to that of hedonists. We have been taught to strive for materialistic possessions, to be successful, and to indulge in the luxuries that said success entails. This, in combination with our tendency to focus on the short-term implications of our actions over the long term, and the belief in the feasibility of infinite growth, has allowed this system to come to fruition.
If you think about the evolution of humans, we grew up in relatively simple circumstances. We were in small groups, living in home ranges that weren't all that extensive. We lived and died within a few dozens of kilometers of each other. So there was no real, pressures on the human mind to think beyond simple cause-effect relationships. Bottom line is this, that the human brain, our cognitive capacities tend to be limited in most people to rather simplistic, reductionist perspectives on reality. Okay. And if you think about that, climate change is a perfect illustration because there are hundreds of things happening, but we fixate on climate change. The focus gets shifted a little bit when something like a pandemic comes along, but then it's all about the pandemic. We forget about climate change. Then there's the war in Ukraine, and we talk about that for a while, and now we're back to climate change. And nobody bothers to connect all of those dots.
Economic and technological advancement occurring at an unprecedented rate has also led many during this era of energy abundance to conclude that human ingenuity is the primary factor underpinning our success, while failing to consider how drastically different our state of affairs would be if we were unable to draw upon these long, untapped energy deposits. Truth is, just a single barrel of oil has the same energy output of over 20,000 hours of strenuous labor from a human being. And yet we have downplayed the influence of fossil fuels on our economy, using it to influence the mental models that underpin how we conduct our lives. If we were to evaluate a barrel of oil in terms of human labour, we would see it for how invaluable it truly is. A single barrel of oil, at $20 per hour of work, is equal to $500,000 in total work. Yet, in reality, such a source of abundant energy costs just over a 10,000th of this price. The conveniences that are now afforded to us within our great civilization have allowed us to specialize in certain fields, crafts, or areas of study, while neglecting the learning of the basic functions necessary for our survival independent of capitalism. The security, living spaces, and resources that we have been provided with far exceed that of even kings of the past. So, this relatively new arrangement raises various issues that are relevant to collapse. Complacency and inaction, overdependence on the current system, and decadence. Complacency and inaction manifests in the presence of the aforementioned conveniences. While we are able to lead high-quality lives, we are more reluctant to take actions that will undermine them. For example, the staggering statistics covered earlier during the section on ecological overshoot, most notably our consumption percentage being 75% over that which planet Earth can provide, indicating that humanity would need to decrease their aggregate resource consumption quite dramatically. This point is even more pertinent in Western nations, who are afforded the most significant conveniences, with the consumption habits of the average citizen requiring, at times, over 3 planet Earths to sustain. I can say fairly confidently that the stark decrease in quality of life this would entail would be out of the question for the vast majority. To add on to this, these consumption habits are likely to require more resources to sustain as economies continue to grow, meaning that the exponential effect discussed earlier is highly relevant. It is also likely that any politicians that will be willing to enact measures that hinder the quality of life of their citizens will be wildly unpopular. Our overdependence on society for our very survival is dangerous, as it is predicated on its long-term persistence. Many people nowadays do not see a departure from the current system to be a feasible approach, as the breadth of skills required to sustain oneself in a simpler system is extensive. And these skills are often poorly developed, if at all. The simpler civilization, the more energy human beings must contribute personally to its maintenance. The majority, at least of those living in Western societies, would be incapable of living in such a system, as many are both physically and mentally unaccustomed to the labour that would be required, while also lacking the knowledge to produce sustainable infrastructure. As such, many will see the current system as their lifeline, desperately clinging to it as it is all they've ever known, and the alternative would be much worse. The collapse of a civilization is oftentimes preceded by what is known as decadence, a decline in moral and cultural values resulting from excessive hedonistic pursuit. A pertinent example of the influence of decadence on civilizations lies in the fate of the Roman Empire. During the later years of the empire, corruption within Rome's government became apparent, with many leaders indulging in luxuries such as sensualism and excessive sexual relations. Their negligence to address issues that arose and pose a threat to the empire, for example, high inflation rates, the prominence of disease, civil wars, and high military losses, resulted in it being vulnerable to outside forces. Capitalizing on this period of weakness, the Germanic people invaded Rome, conquering it, and the Germanic leader Oshasha came to sit atop the throne. While our contemporary civilization is considerably more advanced and complex than the Roman Empire, I believe there is still much to be gleaned from this story that is of relevance to it. Notably, the negligence of important issues by members of the government who seek to bolster the profits of corporations for financial gain. This could be seen as prioritizing an increase in quality of life for the individual at the expense of the planet and the citizens looking up to them. However, the presence of mass media, which facilitates the spreading of propaganda and misinformation in the 21st century, permits this behavior to continue with near impunity. We have yet to see any significant revolts or endeavours from the masses to overthrow the current corrupt power system. However, unlike the Roman Empire, decadence is also present in the behaviours and attitudes of citizens living within society. This is not necessarily an issue that can be attributed solely to governmental corruption. For one, consumerism itself entails the pursuit of hedonism, and this process appears to act as a sedative, thus disincentivizing uprisings. If we are provided with a constant supply of entertainment through social media, through entertainment platforms such as streaming services and video games, our attention naturally falls elsewhere. Escapism allows us to avoid dwelling on many of the issues that are plaguing us as individuals and society at large. The result is a system that allows a disproportionate amount of power and influence to be obtained and misused by authority figures.
At the UN this week, new warnings about the global threat of climate change and the need for governments to respond.
The situation we are witnessing now is the demonstration that climate change is out of control.
Leading scientists have told the BBC they're concerned by the recent run of new climate records being set, saying the speed and timing of them is unprecedented. Some fear we're already witnessing worst-case scenarios.
Authorities in Libya say thousands are dead there after a massive storm flooded coastal community.
Climate change, or global warming, is often presented as the greatest existential threat facing mankind, and we are repeatedly warned of the risks that neglecting it could entail for our planet, our civilization, and us as individuals. The long-term nature of the problem, and its gradual increase in severity, has led many to relegate it to the back of their thoughts, and some to even outright deny it. What is interesting about climate change, though, is that it receives a great deal of attention, and, in some cases, hyperfixation from society, without really considering why the problem exists in the first place. Sure, humanity's fervent desire to emit greenhouse gas emissions is how it's caused, but there is a deeper explanation underpinning it.
So climate change is our fixation because there are obvious symptoms that many people can relate to. But it's only one of, we could spend the whole day talking about plunging biodiversity, ocean acidification, soil and land erosion, on and on and on. Every single so-called environmental problem is a symptom of the same issue, which is overshoot. overshoot is the fundamental issue. And the fundamental issue is the cause of all of these other problems.
Climate change is merely a consequence of humanity exceeding the world's aggregate carrying capacity to such an extent that it is unable to account for the vast quantity of waste emitted by our actions. It demonstrates that the implications of the infrastructure that we have constructed to sustain our overpopulation far exceeds the capacity of the systems by which we were previously constrained. The rapid pace at which changes are occurring to the natural order demonstrates just how severe our case of overshoot truly is. At present, our goal, as expressed at many climate conferences and summits, is to seek to remain below a 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold.
Our planet has already warmed by as much as 1.2 degrees, and we see the devastating consequences everywhere. In 2020, climate disasters forced 30 million people to flee their homes, 3 times more than those displaced by war and violence. Just 2 weeks ago, the IPCC confirmed that half of humanity is already living in the danger zone. Small island nations, least developed countries, and poor and vulnerable people everywhere are one climate shock away from doomsday. In our globally connected world, no country and no corporation can insulate itself from these levels of chaos. Ladies and gentlemen, if we continue with more of the same, we can kiss 1.5 goodbye.
The significance of the 1.5 degree threshold has been revealed in a recent paper published by Armstrong McKay and colleagues, entitled "Exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming could trigger multiple climate tipping points." In the context of climate change, a tipping point is an event that is oftentimes irreversible and results in significant detrimental changes to the climate system that affect the world at large and human societies.
Once we cross them, even by a little bit, big changes can happen abruptly and irreversibly. They gather speed on their own. Coral reefs dying en masse, ice sheets collapsing, not just melting little by little. Huge ocean currents getting thrown off course. Once we cross the tipping point, what seems like just another little increment of global warming sets off a sequence of events, one that stays in motion even after we reverse that little last increment of warming. Changes in the climate start to run away from our ability to do much about them.
What is quite staggering about this title is that many of these proposed tipping points were initially predicted to be reached on higher levels of warming, meaning that we would have been provided with more time to prepare for and potentially change course to avoid them. With the very real threat of reaching these tipping points in the near future, the climate crisis has the potential to ramp up quite severely. As shown in the image, there are 6 tipping points that could be triggered below 2 degrees Celsius of warming. The scientific consensus holds that, realistically, these tipping points will likely occur if 1.5 degrees Celsius is exceeded, although there is some leeway here. Warnings are being administered by scientists who are predicting that the chance this threshold will be exceeded in the next 5 years could be almost as high as 50%. This indicates that there is a decent likelihood that these events will affect us as early as 5 years in the future. The collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet will result in the rising of global sea levels by a staggering 3 meters, potentially leading to the flooding of some coastal cities and displacing tens of millions of people. This could also have a significant effect on coastal aquifers, as saltwater intrusion could occur. Water supplies could be affected as a result, potentially leading to the occurrence of droughts. Even this situation is fairly tame in comparison to the possibility of the Greenland ice sheet collapsing, which would lead to a global sea level rise of over double that of the West Antarctic ice sheet, 7 meters, thus leading to similar implications with considerably more severity.
You melt those ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica? The water levels will rise and come to the level of the Statue of Liberty's elbow. Okay? So, we are talking not so much, oh, it's so hot, it's going to kill me. No, we're talking about sea level change. And where are all the greatest cities in the world? They're on the ocean's edge, on the river's edge. My point is, what's going to happen first? The coastal cities will get flooded. You're not going to just see water levels slowly rise. That will happen, but that's not what you're going to notice first. The storm, the swell, that previously only brought the water to here, now breaches your city walls. You'll see it in the extremes of the weather.
This morning, a new study warns sea levels are rising in the south, accelerating rapidly since 2010, putting tens of millions in the path of future floods.
We haven't seen anything comparable over the past century.
The Met Office says the sea around the UK is now rising by 3 to 5 millimetres each year, more than double the rate a century ago. It may not sound like much, but couple it with extreme events like last year's Storm Arwen, which are only set to increase, then the risk is a brutal remoulding of landscapes and their communities.
Permafrost is a layer of soil that remains below freezing temperature throughout the course of the year. The condition of this soil allows carbon to be trapped inside. If the boreal forest permafrost were to fall as abruptly as predicted, significant quantities of carbon dioxide will be released into the atmosphere, contributing greatly to warming and accelerating the climate crisis. This process has the potential to occur in a short time frame. The abrupt loss of ice in the Barents Sea could have a significant impact on sea temperatures. This is because one effect of sea ice is that it is capable of reflecting a great deal of sunlight back into the atmosphere instead of having the heat be absorbed into the ocean. In the absence of this ice, the temperature of oceans will rise, which can contribute greatly to the bleaching of coral reefs and the melting of Earth's ice sheets, potentially increasing the likelihood of the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets collapsing. Additionally, heat that would normally be trapped under the ice would be released back into the atmosphere. Perhaps the most severe implication of this event is its disruption of normal ocean circulation, which could affect the global climate through greater levels of warming. While the risk of the collapse of the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, also known as the AMOC, is depicted as being a risk at greater than 4 degrees Celsius of warming, this is actually forecast as being a possibility at any time from between 2025 to the end of this century, although the scientific consensus is that the possibility of this occurring in 2025 is very unlikely. However, it does remain as a looming possibility that could be catastrophic for the climate. The AMOC is responsible for circulating water around the Atlantic Ocean. The system ensures that warmer waters are distributed north, whereas cooler waters are transported south. The consequences of an AMOC collapse will be fluctuations in temperature that may even be felt globally, that would entail storms, droughts, and sea level rises. Clearly, climate tipping points present a significant threat to our civilization. While the tipping points I covered here are of immediate concern, the other tipping points outlined by Armstrong, McKay and colleagues may still be reached even if steps were to be taken to limit our greenhouse gas emissions. Firstly, predictions hold that the melting of Arctic sea ice, as touched on earlier, could release up to 1 trillion tons of carbon into the atmosphere, which will raise global temperatures significantly. Other predictions range from an increase of 0.16 degrees Celsius to 0.21 degrees Celsius. In addition to this, we must also consider the influence of a phenomenon known as aerosol masking. Buckley and colleagues argue in their paper, The Largest Elephant in the Room, Aerosol Masking, that efforts to limit carbon emissions may inadvertently lead to an acceleration of global warming. Aerosol masking is a process that occurs naturally. Human-made aerosols are released into the atmosphere, primarily through the burning of fossil fuels, which then reduce the influence of greenhouse gases through a cooling effect. The loss of these aerosols could lead to significant increases in global temperatures quite rapidly. What this indicates then is that the influence of greenhouse gases on the climate is far greater than they have been presented in many models. Perhaps the most salient issue with greenhouse gases is their lifetime. Carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for 300 to 1,000 years, meaning that the warming our planet is committed to may be long-term. While methane does have a significantly shorter lifespan in 12 years, its potency is much greater than that of carbon dioxide. So, it seems that humanity finds itself at a crossroads. Reduce climate emissions and potentially face skyrocketing temperatures, or continue business as usual and allow the crisis to exacerbate gradually until irreversible tipping points are reached. Climate change lag is another phenomenon worthy of consideration. The ocean naturally absorbs a surprisingly large amount of emissions that enter the atmosphere, and then proceeds to release them decades later. So, regardless of whether we were to cut our emissions, we would still see global warming continue to take effect, as these long-preserved emissions are gradually released back into the atmosphere. Crucially, though, this process will contribute significantly to the warming of our planet. It is seemingly unavoidable, and will likely entail us being at risk of even more tipping points.
Well, that haze in North America comes as scientists officially confirm that an El Niño weather event has begun.
In the short term, a significant threat is presented in the form of a super El Niño. An El Niño is a periodic event whereby sea temperatures rise in the central and eastern Pacific Ocean. This is a threat because it can lead to an increase in global temperatures, resulting in an increase in the occurrence of natural disasters such as floods and heat waves, as well as droughts. A recent paper released by Hansen, J and colleagues, appropriately named Uh-Oh, outlines what we can expect from this super El Niño. They propose that 3 mechanisms will come into play which will lead us to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming before the end of 2024. The first mechanism, as touched on earlier, is a reduction in human-made aerosols, making the warming effects of greenhouse gases more potent. They predict that the long-term global warming rate will accelerate by as much as 50%. They then argue that changes in solar irradiance, will lead to global temperature changes that may contribute a few hundredths of a degree Celsius. Finally, they raise some feedbacks that may contribute to the acceleration of global warming, notably an increased energy flux from the sun and a decline in sea ice, leading to an increase in temperature. The Super El Nino is forecast to be right around the corner, and this is demonstrated in the graph featured in the paper, and, for some of the reasons discussed previously, its influence is likely to be more profound than previous Super El Nino events. In other words, unprecedented times are ahead that may lead to global catastrophe. This is a paper that I would highly recommend reading, as the information it provides is invaluable in attempting to understand our short-term situation. In addition to the climate, human actions have massively impacted aspects of the environment. Our rapid expansion into other species' ecosystems has proven to be catastrophic, not only for them, but also for their habitats. Activities such as deforestation, land occupation, and over-exploitation of natural environments has led to a considerable decrease in biodiversity. 96% of the world's mammalian biomass now comprises humans, farmed animals, and pets, with wild animals only comprising 4%. The natural order has been disrupted significantly. So much so, in fact, that scientists believe we have found ourselves in a new geological epoch known as the Anthropocene, characterized by a changing climate and world attributed to humanity's actions and rapid expansion. Furthermore, the implications of these changes has led to what scientists are now referring to as the 6th mass extinction.
5 times in the past, something has happened on the planet that's killed off a very large portion of the life forms and has taken million years to reestablish. Fortunately, the last one was 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs bit the dust with a lot of other things. We are now moving into another one of these events that could easily ruin the lives of everybody on the planet, because we're utterly dependent on the other organisms for our food, for our climate, for all sorts of things that we must have, the so-called natural services that other organisms provide. Look at a conservative estimate of how fast mammals are going extinct today. It runs somewhere between, say, 15 and 100 times as fast as the new fast rate from the past. What our paper is basically the icing on the cake. It shows without any significant doubt that we are now entering the 6th great mass extinction event.
We may be able to feel the implications of biodiversity loss even now. With the new prevalence of animal agriculture, animals selectively bred to possess certain characteristics, such as growing larger or producing more milk, for example, now make up the majority of the mammalian biomass in the world. They are solely reliant on humans to provide them with the resources crucial to their survival, as well as the propagation of their species. While this may not sound like a terrible arrangement on the surface, these animals are not substitutes for functioning ecosystems, and their widespread breeding is highly unnatural. Like us, they are in Overshoot. The food they are provided with is usually sourced from industrial farms, which are highly reliant on fossil fuels. Firstly, the production of fertilizer to ensure that the farmland used is able to provide the nutrients conducive to efficient crop growth require fossil fuels. Secondly, harvesting the crops via combine harvester requires a great deal of fuel, which is also sourced from fossil fuels. What this indicates then is that it is a very fickle system. In the absence or reduced availability of these fossil fuels, farmed animals will die rapidly due to a drastically reduced crop yield and will not be able to propagate themselves as they are not components of natural ecosystems. So, natural environments, many of which have already been picked clean by humans, will not be able to satisfy our food requirements. What this all means is that our food situation would be even more severe than my earlier explanation would imply. The importance of soil in our agricultural system should also not be understated. It is absolutely essential for soil to remain fertile so that it can be used for crop production. However, a phenomenon known as topsoil erosion occurs when topsoil is exposed to the elements. This can cause it to dry out or be washed or blown away by water or the wind. Excessive use of fertilizers can also expedite the erosion process, in addition to excessive irrigation and tillage of the soil. Due to these threats, soil is degrading at an unprecedented rate. In most regions, the process is occurring at 20 to 30 times the rate of restoration, even going as high as 100 times in some regions. What this shows is that, like fossil fuels, soil is a finite resource that we are running out of quite rapidly. It takes millennia for 5 centimeters of soil to form, and only a few years for it to degrade. Soil projections indicate that the amount of arable land per each inhabitant of our planet will have reduced by 50% by 2050, leading to a catastrophic decrease in food production. Our influence on the natural world can also be seen in the state of the world's oceans. Much of our fish is sourced from industrial fishing, which entails the use of large nets in order to catch as many fish as possible. Through the normalization of this practice, trillions of fish are killed every single year. This is an incomprehensibly high number, clearly demonstrating that we are faced with a problem of overfishing. Fish population is reducing dramatically, and far faster than it will be capable of regenerating. National Geographic cites a study indicating that the world may see fishless oceans by 2048. Clearly, marine ecosystems are being devastated, some even irreparably, and even now, some areas of the ocean have been left completely devoid of marine life. These are known as ocean dead zones. The implications of ocean dead zones are much more severe than their obvious effects on biodiversity and ecosystems. There are many organisms that live in the ocean that photosynthesize, such as seaweed, phytoplankton, and algae. This is the primary reason why the ocean is oftentimes referred to as the lungs of the earth. The photosynthesizing of these organisms results in a great deal of carbon being taken in and a great deal of oxygen being put out. As much as 80% of the world's oxygen is emitted from the ocean. The killing of these organisms through our overfishing trends will greatly influence the climate crisis, as more carbon will be released into the atmosphere. Following the end of the 20th century's world conflicts, Western nations were afforded an era of unprecedented peace. For the most part, we have all been living in harmony with each other. Our cohesion reached its fruition with the formation of NATO, as we acknowledge that a future of collaboration with other nations increases the likelihood of achieving a future characterized by human prosperity. After all, our system of international global trade is highly reliant on this peace holding. This state of communion is undoubtedly a benefit in many ways, although its social implications are oftentimes quite understated. Firstly, the value of fortitude has decreased. We now live in situations where our physical safety and security is at the highest it has ever been, with legal institutions and new forms of surveillance technology ensuring that infractions are reported and acted upon. As a result, we have not been faced with nearly as many physical threats as those who lived in prior civilizations. The life expectancy of those living within Western nations has continued to rise, and the most prevalent causes of death comprise diseases that generally tend to affect people later in life. Importantly, the likelihood of falling victim to homicide is remarkably low, being as low as a 1 in 200 chance in America. The point is that taking physical risks is no longer nearly as necessary, and being subject to physical suffering is not nearly as common with the sophistication of the civilization we live under. The conveniences we are provided with afford us easier and more prosperous lives. This means that we are not provided with as many opportunities to develop our fortitude, leaving us relatively unaccustomed to serious crises and conflicts. This is an issue because those who were capable of and accustomed to braving adversity were those who allowed this civilization to come to fruition. Those who were strong, both mentally and physically, and capable of using that strength to defend themselves and those who they held dear, were always invaluable to societies placed under turmoil. Those were the people who won our wars, and those were the people who made the difficult decisions that were crucial for the maintenance of the community against dangerous outside forces. These are the traits that are generally associated with masculinity. We would see them present in individuals such as warriors, generals, rulers, and even many of those living within hunter-gatherer groups. Nowadays, a shift in dynamic characterized by peace and a more secure lifestyle has led to a decline in such individuals. In fact, these traits are often seen as being inherently dangerous, and those possessing them may find themselves ostracized. Perhaps they may feel that they are no longer warranted a place within society. With a decline in masculinity comes an increase in vulnerability. Crises that arise will be more difficult for the population to contend with, especially if they are severe. In times of conflict, it can be assumed that people will also be more apprehensive to participate, perhaps preferring to flee their country instead. This could lead to a decline in military force, with the use of various technologies being expected to account for this. People may also be less likely to organize protests or uprisings due to fearing the legal implications of doing so, meaning that the current corrupt power system is likely to remain in place without being greatly challenged. Our characteristic human resilience appears to be declining in this era of security, peace, and abundance, making us relatively unprepared for the hard times ahead. It seems that we have found ourselves in the midst of a masculinity crisis.
I had a conversation with a friend one day, and we was talking about family and life, and I asked him, "How do you see your kid's future?" And he said to me, "My grandfather walked 10 miles to work every day. My father walked 5. I'm driving a Cadillac. My son is in a Mercedes." He said my grandson will be in a Ferrari. But he said my great-grandson will be walking again. So I asked him, I said, "Well, why is that?" And he said to me, "Tough times create strong men. Strong men create easy times. Easy times create weak men. Weak men create tough times." He said to me, "Many will not understand, but you have to raise warriors."
The social implications of this era extend beyond that of a decline in masculinity. The normalization of technological abundance, in combination with other factors, has affected the social dynamics between men and women in ways that were perhaps unforeseen. For the first time in recent history, we have been provided with opportunities to meet others online, allowing relationships to be fostered in the virtual world. The options that we now have extend far beyond that of humans of the past, with dating apps facilitating a process of interaction and subsequent romantic connection with such a wide range of potential partners that some find themselves with almost too much choice. In the past, we would likely seek to find someone within our social circle or local community that we would deem to be a suitable match. For much of our evolutionary history, we would likely not be exposed to anything nearing the hundreds of potential partners, and yet nowadays the choices are, quite practically, almost endless. An initial interpretation may see great value in this dynamic shift, as we are now provided with more opportunities, and so finding a partner should be easier. Interestingly, this does not appear to be entirely true upon consideration of the statistics. Young men are, reportedly, having less sex than ever, with a 2018 survey demonstrating that 28% of them reported no sex in the past year. This rate is triple that which was noted in 2008. In addition to this, 63% of young men were single in 2021, whereas less than half of women were single. The difference here is considerable, and it is clear that there is a widening gap between both genders, one that technological abundance cannot account for on its own. Instead, there is an apparent interplay between technological abundance and biological factors that have skewed the results. A fundamental difference between men and women, in a general sense, lies in partner selection. Women tend to desire men who they consider to be of a similar or higher social status than themselves. They date on their level and up. This is known as hypergamy, and from an evolutionary perspective, there is ample explanation for its existence. Men who were perceived to possess favourable characteristics, such as the ability to protect, to provide, and to rear children, were preferred over those who were not. There was more incentive for the propagation of these genes and the potential for a role as a strong father.
Human females engage in hypergamy, and hypergamy is and this is also true cross-culturally, and it's also quite, it's just as extensive in Scandinavia. Not quite, there's a bit of attenuation, but not much. Women mate across and up dominance hierarchies. Men mate across and down. Okay, and that has to be the case because obviously it has to work that way. If one goes up, the other has to go down. The socioeconomic status of a woman is determines almost zero of her attractiveness towards a man. Whereas the socioeconomic status of a man is a major determinant of his attractiveness towards a woman. And it isn't his wealth either, because that's been tested. It's his capacity to generate and be productive and to share, because that beats the hell out of wealth. Wealth can disappear, right? But the capacity to be productive and share, that's a much more important element. And why not be chosen on the basis of that, especially because women have to have infants, and infants make the woman dependent, and the woman is just looking logically, rationally, and from an evolutionary perspective for someone who's useful enough to lend a hand.
A notable dynamic on dating apps provides a profound demonstration of hypergamy in action. Many men find matching with others on these apps to be exceedingly difficult, with men who are perceived as average finding very few matches. Conversely, however, women who are perceived as average find themselves with an abundance of options. Time magazine reports that men swipe right to match 3 times more often than women do, with men doing it 46% of the time and women only doing it 14% of the time. The median female user receives about 2.75 matches a day, whereas the median male user only receives about 1.1 matches.
Women are interested in men based on 3 criteria. The first is their ability to signal resources. The second is intelligence, and the third is kindness. It doesn't matter how rich or how smart you are. If you're an asshole or you're not kind, people eventually don't want you as a mate. And unfortunately online, it's very difficult to signal 2 and 3, so you can signal 1. And when everyone has access to everyone, women who have a much finer filter for mating, because the downside of sex is so much greater for them if they get pregnant, so they have much finer filter, they end up all being drawn or expressing interest to a much smaller group of individuals. So what the dynamic is, you have 50 men on Tinder, 50 women on Tinder. 46 of the women will express all of their interest to just 4 men, which leaves 46 men vying for the attention of just 4 women.
Conventionally attractive men who appear to be of good social standing and bring in a decent amount of income naturally do find themselves in much better stead than others though, as would be expected. With this prioritization of favourable characteristics, in addition to a wide range of options, women appear to be inclined to pursue those near the top, with those even a few rungs lower on the ladder seeing comparably little success. An emerging disparity is also apparent in the educational sphere. In the US, colleges now enroll roughly 6 women for every 4 men, and this gap appears only to be widening. This is also represented in the gender distribution of those who attained bachelor degrees, as shown by the following graph. In 2019 to 2020, the gap was reportedly as high as 16%.
Women are roughly twice as likely as men to say that they will value financial prospects in a partner. About 78% of women say that a stable job is something that is important for a partner to have, whereas around about only sort of 45% of men say the same thing. So as women rise up through their own competence hierarchy in education and employment, they further shorten down the potential pool of eligible men that are as educated or more educated and as employed or more employed than they are. This is a challenge. This is just a straight up imbalance, right? What this causes is a very large group of men toward the bottom of this distribution to be essentially invisible to women. It causes a very large number of women, an increasing cohort, to compete for an increasingly small group of turbocharged super performers at the top.
While it is not immediately clear what factors are underpinning this phenomenon, there are some potential contributors that can be considered which appear to be intricately linked with the aforementioned masculinity crisis. Firstly, the nature of human goal-seeking behaviour is of particular importance. We are now able to seek pleasure in many activities without a similar degree of effort being associated with them. These activities could be seen as alternative stimuli, and they are not necessarily as beneficial. For example, achievements in a video game as opposed to achievements in the real world. A further example may lie in the prevalence of adult content on the internet. It could be argued that men are increasingly seeing it as an alternative to pursuing women, and so it serves as a form of sedation. Secondly, there has been a reported dramatic decrease in average testosterone levels amongst the male population, reported from as early as 1960. This presents some issues through the implications of lowering testosterone levels, a lowering sperm count, the accumulation of more body fat and less muscle mass, a lack of energy, and the potential development of mental health conditions, among many others. This could be taken to indicate that aspects of men are becoming less attractive to women, and, in combination with alternative stimuli, their drive to pursue them may be declining. While inconclusive, merit to this perspective is seen through a survey conducted by psychologist Mark Travers, who found that 53% of single men reported that their fear of being seen as creepy has reduced their likelihood of interacting with women. According to the Institute for Family Studies, close to half of college-educated women say they remain single due to an inability to find someone who meets their expectations. By extension, a study conducted by Morgan Stanley predicts that 45% of women will be single and childless by 2030. Even couples who find themselves in a healthy relationship may not necessarily want children. A new survey has revealed that only 55% of Gen Z plan to have children. What this all indicates is that there is an ongoing mating crisis, and the implications of this will become more apparent as time goes on. Future generations will need to contend with aging populations that require support, while there will not be nearly enough of them to uphold this duty. Additionally, deprivations in the workforce will become apparent, as there will be less people to carry out the crucial tasks that are conducive to the maintenance of civilization. The incomprehensibly large system that we have built for ourselves requires operators, and we are set to run out of them far quicker than we may expect. With the rise of our techno-industrial civilization came the development of more efficient and brutal animal agriculture practices in order to satisfy a rapidly increasing consumer demand for food products. Many of us are familiar with these practices. Pigs crammed wall to wall in tight, unhygienic cells, and chickens competing for space in a barn packed with others of their kind. What is quite tragic about these new practices not only lies in the lives they prescribe these animals, but also in the potential future they prescribe us. Growing fears in the medical industry point to the risks associated with them and how they may pose a threat to our health. The close proximity in which the animals live to each other, in combination with the squalid nature of the environments they must inhabit, provides optimal conditions for diseases to develop and to spread amongst them. To counteract this, they must be given a great number of antibiotics to increase their likelihood of survival, and even then, some will still perish to these diseases. In fact, a staggering 80% of all antibiotics in the US are fed to farm animals. This is far from ideal from a health perspective. Not only are there fewer antibiotics available for human recipients, but their frequent exposure to these diseases can lead to the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The defense mechanisms that are developed against these antibiotics are now easily propagated to other hosts, leading to new, potentially untreatable strains. This poses a threat to humans for a range of reasons. Firstly, while these diseases may initially pose a threat only to animals, their rapid spread can lead to rapid mutation. One such mutation can include an ability for them to spread to human hosts, which would prescribe them the label of zoonotic disease. A well-known example of a zoonotic disease is one not easily forgotten, as it affected the entire world: COVID-19. Thought to originate from bats in Wuhan, China, the virus developed capabilities to spread rapidly between human hosts, quickly throwing the world into turmoil before being declared a pandemic. Some evidence also suggests that the way meat is produced contributed to the rise of COVID-19, although this is inconclusive. It does seem then that factory farms could be the source of future pandemics, especially if we consider the frequent exposure of farm animals to humans, be it through those who work in these facilities or even through the transportation of the animals across public areas. It seems that in many ways, our poor treatment of the other species with which we share this planet will eventually bite us in the back. Many of the dynamics that we see in modern political developments indicate that there are rising tensions between the world's most powerful nations. One immediate example of this is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has sparked worldwide debate and interest. Ukraine's perception as the victim in this conflict has warranted what appears to be almost unequivocal support from the West, having it receive not only financial aid, but also aid in the form of military assets. With the US being the major contributor towards this,
I approve the next tranche of U.S. security assistance to Ukraine, including more artillery, more ammunition, more anti-tank weapons.
Ukraine has been able to sustain itself against Russia's assault under Vladimir Putin for almost 2 years.
Число его жертв полностью лежит на западных элитах. И, конечно, на киевском режиме сегодняшнем, для которого украинский народ, по сути дела, чужой.
This has led what would have likely otherwise been a short and relatively easy victory for Russia to become a hard-fought, prolonged conflict that is devastating its economy and military forces. Contributing also to the major recession that the Russian economy has now found itself in are the sanctions that have been placed on the country. These include restrictions on the exporting of energy resources to Western countries, notably natural gas. The implications of these sanctions have been quite severe. In the UK, a cost of living crisis has arisen, greatly influenced by the reduced availability of energy imports from Russia.
So you've got to heat your house or buy your food, it's one or the other.
It is clear why this occurred. In 2021, Russia was the world's second largest producer of natural gas. This demonstrates the extent to which we are reliant on the resources provided by other countries, and how crucial our globally connected system is for the maintenance of civilization. The war in Ukraine is a decent arrangement when viewed through the lens of maintaining US hegemony. The US is able to degrade the military of one of its greatest military threats at a fraction of the cost without needing to expend its own troops. At its current state, Russia is unable to pose much military competition to the US. While this may initially appear to be a good thing, it should not be expected that Putin would be willing to lose this war, especially considering the damage that it has already wrought throughout Russia. If so, it would undermine his power and reputation, and his dictatorship will come to an end. He would meet a fate much too similar to that of Khrushchev in the 1960s, when he withdrew in the face of threatening nuclear war with the US. It is not beyond the realms of plausibility that Putin could decide to draw upon the nuclear weapons he has at his disposal, leading to a war of unprecedented destruction. What is also worthy of consideration is the role that China has to play in the global political landscape. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has seen the rise of President Xi Jinping to power in the year 2013. He is, by all accounts, the most powerful man in the world. Not only does he have dominion over one of the richest nations in the world with the largest population, but his influence over it can be ruled as absolute. His occupation of office has been marked by a dictatorship and authoritarian rule over the population, and egregious violations of human rights have been carried out under his rule, facilitated by the CCP. Examples include the detainment of millions of those who are members of Muslim minority groups in internment camps. Their influence has also been made on China's population as a whole, with the enforcement of forced sterilization and abortion campaigns, limiting Chinese residents to one child per family, as well as through the restriction of various platforms on the internet and the extensive censorship of content. There is also a crucial distinction to be drawn between the political influence of money in China and many Western countries. The process of lobbying was touched on earlier, and its influence on the policies that eventually come to fruition. Interestingly, China is not considered a traditionally capitalist country, as this merging of state and corporate power has not occurred. In fact, the CCP has considerable power over them, instead of the other way around as traditionally capitalist countries seem to operate. So what we have is a nation that presents a significant threat to US hegemony, governed by a president and political party with absolute power, known for the employment of unethical practices.
我命令全军各级要强化练兵备战鲜明导向。
Clearly, the US itself is no saint, but the strained relationship between these two nations could pose an existential threat to humanity. Firstly, tensions raise over China's alleged desire to occupy Taiwan, despite it being acknowledged as an independent state.
展示了我们维护国家主权和领土完整，绝不承诺放弃使用武力，保留采取一切必要措施的选项。
The US's position on Taiwan is clear. It is steadfast in its determination to protect the country from a Chinese assault were it to occur, as stated by President Biden. If China were to invade Taiwan regardless, the implications of this could be quite severe. The global economy would likely suffer a massive blow due to the inevitable sanctions that would be placed on China and the great influence of the monopoly that it holds on various rare minerals that are crucial for the production of many forms of technology. The prestigious Brookings Institution conducted a study reporting that 60% of the world's rare earth elements are produced by China, and 85% of them are processed by it. There is some indication that China may consider moving on Taiwan. US officials say that Xi has ordered his military to be capable of invading Taiwan by 2027, with a US Air Force general even predicting an attack occurring as early as 2025. He argues that the US's 2024 presidential election will result in the US being distracted, potentially providing an opportunity for invasion. There is some merit to this distraction perspective if we also consider that the attention and resources of the US is now spread across multiple geopolitical fronts. The Russia-Ukraine war, as mentioned earlier, as well as the newly emerged Israel-Hamas conflict, having to divert some of its attention and resources to a third major front in Taiwan, could prove difficult, especially considering the force of its adversary. Secondly, China's actions could be taken to be provocative. It is one of the few countries that is relatively unfazed by the US's hegemonic status. For example, the ramping up of imports from Russia as an attempt to combat the sanctions imposed on it by NATO, in addition to becoming a close trading partner with Cuba. This, an acknowledgement of the embargo that was placed on the country back in the 1960s, still holding to this day. China has also reportedly capitalized on Cuba's strategic position, as demonstrated by the establishment of a spy station in the country. Being located only 90 miles from the coast of Florida, this station could intercept commercial and military communications from several southeastern US states, as argued on an article published by The Diplomat. The 2023 annual report on China released by the Pentagon also indicates an upsurgence in China's provocative behaviours in the Indo-Pacific region, while also placing focus on the acceleration of building up its military. It also states that China is seeking to modernize its military across all domains of warfare in pursuit of its aims of reshaping the global power balance. Whether this claim is accurate can be left up to interpretation, as can China's rationale behind engaging in provocative behavior. Thirdly, it could be argued that China has already infiltrated the US and the West at large by means of social media. Some would even accuse the country of conducting meticulously planned psychological warfare. TikTok has quickly dominated the social media sphere, and, impressively, even becoming the most visited site on the internet in 2021 for a day. Produced by the Chinese company ByteDance Limited, it provides users with content that is tailored specifically to their interests in an attempt to maximize the time that is spent on the app. an endeavor that has been remarkably successful.
You tap the logo and it immediately starts calibrating based on what you like, what you swipe up, swipe down on. And before you know it, you're in the ultimate tailored, individualized, singular streaming media network that is just addictive.
Assisting in this process is the short video length, which helps ameliorate feelings of boredom that may arise. This results in a highly addicting app that has enthralled the West, particularly younger generations who already have a propensity towards social media. The app presents a threat in 3 ways. The first threat lies in the psychological effects of continued engagement with it. Users will frequently report experiencing a shortened attention span, brain fog, and an over-dependence on the app for entertainment.
The brains, particularly the developing brain of young children and teens, is starting to get quite used to these short form videos. So what happens is we're starting to see an increase in ADHD. You're less likely to be able to focus, have longer periods of attention and concentration. Reading seems boring. Even watching a movie, they say, is starting to seem boring to kids because it's just too long. They don't have the attention span for it.
As argued in my video dedicated specifically to social media, I liken this to a short effort-reward gap. Users are able to continue scrolling until they find something that excites them, with an algorithm that will continue to supply them with endless content. A study entitled Brain Anatomy Alterations Associated with Social Networking Site SNS Addiction drew an association between social media addiction and reduced grey matter in the amygdala. This implies that TikTok, being even more addictive than any social media site that comes to mind, can induce structural changes in the brain that are perhaps even more considerable. The second threat is the nature of the algorithm used by the app. Having originated from a Chinese company, TikTok could be used as a propaganda tool, intentionally censoring and promoting certain content. This is quite dangerous for those in younger generations, many of whom are already disillusioned with their country. The consumption of anti-American and anti-capitalist content and an increasing collective desire for a career as a social media influencer would serve to disincentivize military participation and support from the populace. It could be expected that this would lead to a decline in social cohesion and the atomization of society. Decadence, too, is particularly relevant here, as the focus continually shifts from productivity to hedonism. The third threat stems from the governance of corporations under the CCP. For all intents and purposes, ByteDance Limited would not be owned by the CEO of the company, but by the CCP itself due to the vast influence it is capable of exercising over it. For example, the legally enforced ability to provide the government with information associated with the app, among many other similar laws. A final point to note on TikTok is that the app itself is prohibited in China, with a similar app known as Douyin being permitted as a replacement. This replacement app sports a different algorithm, one that provides its users with more productive and educational content than TikTok, potentially implying that the CCP has acknowledged the danger the app presents. In light of prior segments, and in particular the section on ecological overshoot and unsustainable energy, a US-China confrontation could be seen as inevitable, but not necessarily imminent. Predictions can be made. As resources become increasingly scarce, crises will become more common, and peace treaties may be shattered as nations struggle to keep themselves afloat. In an attempt to preserve social cohesion amidst these crises, governmental institutions will likely seek to pursue authoritarian or totalitarian regimes.
I am your voice.
A similar process that was noted in the election of Adolf Hitler to address the severe economic recession Germany found itself in following the events of World War I. The monopoly that China holds on rare minerals will have it become a prime target in these turbulent times, potentially facilitating a confrontation between the East and the West. Countries such as Saudi Arabia and Russia would also likely face aggression for their abundant reserves of oil and natural gas, respectively. However, such changes may not be imminent, as the preservation of globalization is crucial for the maintenance of civilization. It is in our best interest for good relations with other nations to be retained for as long as possible. Still, this section could be taken to indicate that cracks in this arrangement are beginning to form already. Many perceive artificial intelligence to be one of the greatest threats posed to humanity. In recent years, developments in this field have been remarkable and unprecedented. From the GPT 3.5 and 4 engines to increasingly sophisticated predictive algorithms, AI has begun to pervade almost all aspects of our digital lives. Much of the fear stems from predictions regarding a point of no return, whereby AI has discovered the ability to self-replicate and possesses what we would perceive to be sentience, so as to develop a conscious capacity to act maliciously against humanity. Taken further, this is regarded as technological singularity, a hypothetical scenario whereby artificial intelligence exceeds human intelligence. Currently, AI models are relatively superficial in how their interactions with humans take place, drawing upon a large database of information to formulate responses, while also occasionally incorporating elements of randomness to make them sound more genuine. This is a far cry from what we would perceive to be sentience, and it appears very unlikely that we will be able to achieve this within AI in the near future, as we still do not understand the mechanisms that would underpin such a process. While this extreme case may be unlikely to come to pass, AI and other sorts of algorithms are already posing threats to civilization. The increased sophistication of AI is oftentimes associated with a degree of automation. One of our primary motivations for developing it is to increase the efficiency of task completion beyond that which human workers would be capable of providing. After all, AI does not suffer from many of the physical limitations that humans do, namely fatigue and discomfort. It will get the job done with impartiality, and will likely even be capable of working on a 24-hour basis. What this indicates is that even AI that is perhaps not as effective as a human in producing a certain desired output, the total work done in a day may exceed a human's simply because it works more hours. The consideration then becomes whether the AI is cheaper to run than the worker is to employ, and, if so, then there is little incentive to keep the worker around. The return on investment is higher when using AI instead. Increasingly, AI is becoming capable of replacing menial labour tasks and routine, predictable tasks. For example, filling in a spreadsheet can be done much quicker using AI, while also eliminating the possibility for human error. As the sophistication of AI continually improves, which does appear to be happening quite rapidly, it will become more feasible for it to reliably complete tasks of increasing complexity. People are already using the GPT engine through ChatGPT to generate art, entire stories, emails, and code samples to save time and effort. With these sorts of capabilities already being feasible, albeit with some hiccups, it is quite easy to envision a world where much of human labour could be automated. However, beneath the veneer of AI is a system that could be subject to legal scrutiny. The large dataset that it's trained on is derived from human creation, leading some to brand it as glorified plagiarism. It could be possible that legal institutions could get a hold on AI before it becomes an even greater threat for this reason. Although it would not be outlandish to still suggest that these accelerating developments in the field of AI could correlate with more people being rendered redundant. In fact, it even seems likely that an unprecedented unemployment crisis is on the horizon if the current trajectory in AI trends continues as is. Gradually, we could see low-skill, and perhaps even medium-skill jobs be phased out as AI begins to occupy these roles. Such a shift in dynamic could be catastrophic for economies around the world, and governments may seek to mitigate the problem through measures such as universal basic income. Only time will tell whether civilization will be able to persist under the weight of these technological advancements, or whether our desire for progress will accelerate collapse. As touched on in the prior section with TikTok, algorithms are beginning to pose a considerable threat to society. The focus is increasingly shifting to the development of algorithms that seek to maximize user engagement and retention. This, by itself, contributes significantly to decadence. However, perhaps a threat that could be considered more significant is the nature of deep learning and how advancements in this area contribute towards more unpredictable algorithms. With the ability to obtain and process information in a similar manner to the human mind, algorithms could naturally fall out of the control of those responsible for them. They will likely not even be able to discern how it will eventually develop itself. The implications of this could be quite severe. Misinformation could be spread, and the more malicious actors existing on the internet could serve as an influence for it. A notable case of this occurring already was back in 2016. Microsoft's AI chatbot, known as Tay, was released on Twitter and was purported to further its conversational understanding by interacting with others. After a mere 24 hours, the chatbot learned to participate in hate speech, posting controversial statements including racism, among other forms of discrimination. Furthermore, the promotion of misinformation through algorithms may not be met with as much scrutiny as should be warranted. Algorithms are oftentimes perceived to be reliable and unquestionable in their judgments, whereas this should not always be the case. Compounding on all the issues with algorithms that have already been raised is the increasing sophistication of deepfake technology that is almost indistinguishable from videos of a real person.
Подумал и решил, что похожим на себя говорить моим голосом должен только один человек.
Taken to the extreme, such technology could be used to impersonate authority figures, potentially to damage their reputation, to spread fake news, or to induce hysteria. The consequences could be disastrous. We are now heading into an era of technology where it will become more and more difficult to distinguish between what is real and what is not. The virtual world will become little more than an enigma, as those we see on the internet will become more effective at distorting the truth. We will no longer know who to trust. What this will all contribute towards is the breakdown of social cohesion in the online world, and perhaps even in the real world, producing large numbers of skeptics and people who will be less willing to cooperate in times of crisis, due to fearing manipulation. When we can no longer work together, the civilization we have built through that exact same means will begin to crumble. Let's take a break from all the doom and gloom, instead asking what we can do about the crises we are facing. Is there any hope for humanity's future? Well, what I say is that there certainly is. After all, we were only able to make it this far because of how resilient we are when faced with adversity. We will have to learn to account for these crises and act accordingly. Those who do so will be those most adequately equipped to persist into the future and to construct new civilizations. While these civilizations may not be as technologically advanced as our current one, they will be more appropriate for our changing world, and more robust as a result. We will move backwards in quality of life, convenience, and safety, but such is the price to pay for our carelessness as a species towards the only planet we have. Some would see it as becoming more in tune with our evolutionary roots, less dependent on alternative stimuli, and more capable of cooperation. Technological advancement has only served to divide us, to disincentivize face-to-face interaction, and to entice us in the virtual. We will once again see ourselves as social units, dependent on one another to contribute towards our survival. It is possible that we may even be able to lead lives that we see as being more fulfilling, as our actions will be expected to contribute towards the well-being of others in our collective. How can we achieve this? We need to develop similar skills to that which our ancestors were expected to be proficient in. Skills that underpin traditional primitive civilizations, for example the construction of shelters, the hunting of game, foraging, the ability to fashion clothes, construct tools, and to farm. However, in a post-technologically dominated world, it would also be feasible to apply more contemporary roles, such as those of the electrician, plumber, or computer engineer, to incorporate and maintain technology, thus reducing human workload wherever possible. It is vitally important to be able to have something to offer. Additionally, it is important for one to develop rapport with their local community, so that it is all but guaranteed that they are more inclined to work together in times of crisis than to attempt to strike out on their own. Cooperation is, and always has been, key throughout human history. So, the focus needs to shift to self-sufficiency, the ability of a community to sustain itself in the absence of many of the conveniences we have today. It will be a difficult transition, but one very necessary in a simplifying world. There are already some examples of this. Known as off-the-grid communities, people living within them grow their own food and maintain their own infrastructure. They generate their own power to assist them with this, allowing technology to operate without needing to rely on the national grid and other forms of energy providers. Clearly, technology can still play a vital role in our future, primarily through renewable energy sources. Naturally, however, wealth will place constraints on this. Solar panels are perhaps the most apparent candidates, and can provide enough electricity to sustain many important functions in a community. Increasingly, eco-architects are also considering how technology can be used to build more sustainable infrastructure. Earthships, for example, are able to catch and harvest water from their environments that can be used to sustain residents, while also being able to provide their own food and electricity. They are commonly built with natural and repurposed materials, much of which are sourced from landfills. An extension of the Earthship's design philosophy lies in the eco-village, which are built to sustain themselves on their local carrying capacity. Those who are proactive and establish such infrastructure could lead humanity into the future with determination, and from the ashes of our current civilization, built upon exploitation and greed, could rise one that is in tune with nature, respects the inhabitants with which we share this planet, and values our fellow human. Due to the distressing nature of this topic, it is important to not allow it to negatively affect your mental health. Practice mindfulness through methods such as meditation. Come to terms with what you now know about what the future could hold in store for us. Acknowledge that there is only so much that we can do as individuals, but don't allow that to impede on your desire to live a fulfilling life. Enjoy yourself and do what comes naturally to you. After all, nothing is set in stone, so I say we persevere and build a future that we can be proud of. Use the information provided here not to wallow in hopelessness, but to light a fire of determination within you for the sake of yourself and all those you hold dear. A fire that you can carry with you during the tough times ahead. Michael Dowd, who has now unfortunately passed away, published a range of videos discussing how to cope with and prepare for collapse. I personally recommend his video series, Living Fully in an Age of Decline, Essential Wisdom for Hard Times. It is also important to share this video with others in order to educate them on the topic if they desire to learn about it, and because it's been a project long in the works. It is one that I've dedicated much of my time and passion to in an attempt to inform others and to build a better future for humanity. After all, if we are aware of the threats we face, then we can take measures to counteract them.